On this week's Talking Politics, Kim Leadbeater joins us in a defining week for her assisted dying bill.
There's potentially a small number of people who might change their mind either way. But if that proves to be the case, it means we've still got a good majority.
Why are there still so many unknowns on how the law would work in reality?
We don't know quite how an assisted dying service will be delivered. We don't know exactly what drugs might be used. We don't know specifics about funding and regulation.
Plus, from Canada, Robert grills the PM on the grooming gangs inquiry and the G7 divide over Iran.
I've been absolutely clear that de-escalation is what is needed here.
So Israel was wrong to bomb?
No, the risk of escalation is huge.
There is a tremendous split. Keir Starmer tries to paper over those cracks, but those cracks are a mile wide.
Welcome to the podcast. I'm Paul Brand. Robert is flying back from Canada as we're recording this, but we'll bring you his highlights of his interview with Keir Starmer at the G7, plus Robert's analysis later in the show. But first, we want to focus on the key talking point here in the UK that will only get louder as the week goes on, the proposed law on assisted dying. The terminally ill adults end-of-life bill will get its crucial third reading and vote in the Commons on Friday, and I am delighted to say I'm joined by the bill's architect, Kim Leadbeater. Hi to you, Kim. How are you feeling ahead of Friday?
Hello there, Paul. I'm okay. It's been a long journey, a tiring journey, but I'm feeling positive and optimistic, and hopefully we can get the bill over the line on Friday.
Okay, well, look forward to talking to you. And also joining us is our health correspondent, Rebecca Barry. Hi, Rebecca.
Hi, Paul. Thanks for having me.
So there's been lots and lots of speculation about what's going to happen on Friday, Kim. How do you think the vote is looking? I know everyone's asking you that question, but people want to know, do you think it's still going to pass?
I think, the way it feels in Parliament is that obviously lots of people are very clear about their positions. Lots of people are very supportive of the bill, and there are people who are fundamentally against the bill. And I think in the middle, there's potentially a small number of people who might change their mind either way. But if that proves to be the case, it means we've still got a good majority and the bill will go forward. So that's how I feel at the moment. But, it's up to every MP to do what they feel is the right thing to do on Friday. And the debate will continue as it should. And we'll see what happens.
Yeah. We've been trying to track how MPs are going to vote, probably not as effectively as the whipping operation in Parliament. But our latest figures that I saw earlier were 148 MPs planning to vote in favour, 139 planning to vote against, 22 remain undecided, 21 due to abstain. And obviously there's a lot of MPs there as well who haven't declared yet. We're only recording people who've told us which way they're going. So it feels tighter than last time. Do you think it will be tighter than last time?
It's impossible to say, to be honest. I'm not keeping that close an eye on it, to be honest. My job is to just have those conversations with colleagues, and it's also to focus on writing my speech and doing everything I can to make sure that people support the bill. But I think, like I say, I think there'll be some movement in both directions. Certainly a few colleagues have come out saying that they are going to support, having either abstained or voted against last time, and then other colleagues have done the same the other way. So I think if there is any movement, it'll be relatively minor. Yeah, and then there will be other colleagues who, as you said, may choose to stay away, which is also a decision I would respect.
Yeah, I agree with you that I think the movement has been relatively minor compared to kind of, expectation that maybe there would be a big shift, that maybe because there's so much work to do with the bill, obviously you had to go through committee stage and scrutiny, etc., and that there may have been this moment where there was a big shift one way or another and people said, right, that's it, that's the defining factor for me. Actually, that hasn't really quite materialised ever, and the movements have been quite small. But nevertheless, there are more MPs, and again, we're talking about small numbers, but more that have moved against than have moved in favour. How do you feel the process has gone for you? Because at times it's become really complicated. At times there have been some flaws that you've had to fix with the bill. Do you feel as though this bill has gone as well as you wanted it to go?
Look, this is how we make laws. The process is the process. And to be honest, there's bills going through Parliament today. I think we're debating the crime and policing bill today. Parliamentary process is complicated, and it can be confusing. But that is the nature of what we do. Now, are there things that I would change about the entire parliamentary process? Yes, there probably are. But if we start unpulling that thread at this stage, we've got a long way to go. So I think the bill has gone through a very robust process. If you think we started this back in November, so it's been a long period of time. The hours of scrutiny that it has had has been more than most government bills. Lots of detailed exploration of the content, amendments looked at and tabled and taken and changes made. And that's quite right too. I mean, some people said at the start, oh, she won't make any changes to it. Well, of course I'll make changes to it if we can do things that are going to strengthen and enhance the legislation. That's how the process works. So I think it's been a really thorough process. I've tried to engage with colleagues, whatever their views are, including on the Bill Committee, some very strong opponents of a change in the law. And I've tried to do that as collaboratively and as collegiately as I possibly can. And I think as a result of that, what Parliament will be presented with on Friday will be an even stronger piece of legislation, and certainly the most robust assisted dying bill in the world.
Well, I want to bring Rebecca in here because, Rebecca, obviously you're monitoring what the various royal colleges are saying, various different groups of medics and other interested parties are feeling about this bill. And it feels to me over the past few weeks there has been a flurry of interventions from the likes of the royal colleges, often saying that they're quite worried about the bill. What have they been saying?
Yeah, well, I think over the last decade, really, just as public perceptions have changed, so too have views in the medical world. It was back in 2021 when the BMA changed their stance from one of opposition to neutrality. And then it was just this year that the Royal College of GPs shifted from opposing assisted dying to neither supporting or opposing it. The Royal College of Nursing also has a neutral stance. But just as among the public and in the Commons, there's not sort of unanimous consensus among these groups and colleges. The Royal College of Psychiatrists, although neutral, they said that they won't support this bill because they have concerns about safety. They say that there are strong links between terminal illness and suicide, and that unmet need can sometimes make somebody feel like life is unbearable. But then a group of prominent psychiatrists came out and spoke out against that opinion, saying that they do support the bill. And just from the doctors that I'm speaking to, there's just such a passionate and polarized opinion. I spoke to a palliative care doctor who described to me real concerns about the lack of the patients that miss out on the palliative care and the social care and NHS services that they should get. These are the sort of invisible, vulnerable people that they fear could potentially end up feeling like a burden and feel like they choose to have an assisted death that is more out of coercion because of a lack of the care, a lack of the provision of the care that they should get. And then equally, I hear from doctors who say, emphasize that a person should have a right to choose over their life and over their death. Autonomy is a word that you hear an awful lot in this debate. So, really conflicting views that I'm hearing from the medical world.
Yeah, I remember spending some time in a hospice at the end of last year to talk to them about assisted dying. It was really interesting how conflicted they were. And Hospice UK, which is the largest charity representing hospices, is neutral as well because its staff are all over the place in terms of how they feel about this. Kim, hospices have come up time and time again. And I know, for example, Paul Waugh, one of the new Labour MPs, has been talking about this a lot recently. He's become quite outspoken about his concern that this bill will detract focus from palliative care, and that actually it would be better in this country to improve palliative care and provide better deaths that way than to introduce assisted dying and potentially detract from palliative care. What do you say to those criticisms?
I think far from it. I think what this debate has actually done already is create a really powerful focus on what end-of-life care and choice looks like in this country. And I think that's a really positive thing. And in other jurisdictions where assisted dying has been introduced, palliative care resources have actually gone up, and that joined-up thinking around end-of-life care has really improved to give patients better choice, better care, and just, a better approach to what choices there are for terminally ill people. But you're absolutely right in the analysis that you've said, because doctors, nurses, palliative care people are all human beings at the end of the day, so they do have their own different views, and that's why every Royal College has a neutral position on assisted dying, and has moved to that, as you say, in some cases over a number of years. I mean, that's the other reason I've included very strong protections, employment protections within the bill, so that anybody, whatever their profession is, they don't have to be involved in the assisted dying process if they don't want to be. Very, very clear about that from the start, and added more to the bill to ensure that's the case, because like yourselves, I've spoken to doctors who passionately feel that dying people should have this choice, and I've spoken to others who think actually this isn't something we should be doing, and I fully respect that decision. I mean, the good thing about this, the law as it would change, is it would give people choice, and as I've said to my dad and various other people, you don't have to do it. If this isn't something you think you would want, if you ever find yourself in that dreadful situation of having a terminal diagnosis, then you can quite easily say, no, this isn't for me. And actually, in other countries, the evidence shows that often people will sign up for the process and they never actually do it anyway, but it provides such relief and such comfort that their last few weeks or months are much more comfortable, because they know they've got that sort of safety valve almost there if they need it.
Rebecca.
Kim, I'd love to ask, with such opposing views on this, to what extent have the voices of doctors, nurses, healthcare professionals informed your bill?
Very much, yeah, very much. I mean, I had meetings with the BMA very early on, invited them into my office, sat down with them, similarly with other organisations, and I was really keen to have their input. So my door has been open to speak to anybody who wants to talk about this issue, and the conclusion I very firmly came to early on, and I still hold very strongly, is we can give people this choice safely. We can do it in a compassionate way, but what we can also do, and this is a really important point, is we have to fix the status quo, because at the moment we have a situation where terminally ill people can do a number of things. They can have brilliant palliative care and have a very peaceful death, and that's great for those people that can do that. But there are people who feel so scared or so nervous about what the end of their life is going to look like, and they don't want to be in pain, that they take their own lives because they want control and they feel that that's the only way to do it. We have people who, and I have a colleague who's had a relative done this recently, who feel the only way they can take control is to basically starve themselves to death. Now, that's legal to do that. But how can that be legal when giving someone the option of assisted dying isn't? We've also got the huge inequality of Dignitas in Switzerland. So if you've got £15,000, you can book a flight and go there to take control of your death. But that's not an easy option. That's an incredibly traumatic thing for people to do, and particularly for the families of those people. Because we also know, and this is where the law fails very clearly, those families are then subject to a criminal prosecution. So the police knock on the door, and the police have got to do their job. It's not fair that you're dealing with loss and grief and bereavement, and then you've got a police investigation. So there's so many layers of what goes on now that are wrong. And that's why, as legislators, we've clearly got a duty to do something about it.
It's interesting as well, Kim, that the status quo at the moment does allow essentially for some assistance at the end of life. If someone's in a lot of pain, their death sort of can be brought about and eased. I mean, I've got personal experience of this in the past 6 months. I lost two uncles, actually, and both of them at the end of their life were essentially given the option to increase their painkillers to such an extent that it would, as a byproduct of relieving their pain, it would speed their death, essentially. But what opponents of the bill say is it's very different doing that to then putting death on the table earlier on in a diagnosis, for example, and saying, look, this is a real option for you. It could be a good option for you. And then potentially introducing a bit of pressure on people to feel as though they have to go down that road. And you talk about the scrutiny of your bill and the amendments to your bill, but in total, there have only been, how many amendments is it? A dozen or so amendments? And there were hundreds that were suggested. So opponents say, actually, there hasn't been enough room to amend the bill that you've brought, that you've been quite determined to keep it in its current form.
I think we took, we discussed over 500 amendments at Bill Committee stage, and I think we took over 100 amendments which actually went into the bill, so I'm not sure where that number's come from. So, yeah, a significant amount of change was made in Bill Committee, and then there will be more change made through report stage. So I think it's unfair to say that there haven't been changes and that process has been anything other than very thorough. And again, I took those amendments from people who were fundamentally opposed to a change in the law, but also working with them, because if we do do change the law, we want a safe and a robust bill. So the things like banning advertising, which I worked with Harriet Baldwin on, who will never vote for the bill, but she wants it to be safe if it does go through. Issues around coercion, we took amendments which would mean that every single doctor and every single member of the panels has to have additional training around coercive control and domestic abuse. So there's lots of layers of changes that have been added, and for me that's got to be a good thing.
Rebecca, let's talk about some of the things that the bill doesn't necessarily determine at this stage. And I think, Kim, you would happily accept that there are bits in there that are left to be determined by the Department of Health and Social Care later on. What are some of the unknowns about which direction the bill could go in as it's actually implemented, if it gets through, Rebecca?
Well, I think a lot of people will be really surprised, actually, at how vague the bill is on detail, how many things we don't know. We don't know quite how an assisted dying service would be delivered. We don't know exactly what drugs might be used. We don't know specifics about funding and regulation. Would it sit within our current health system? There are concerns about resources within that. Would it sit as a sort of hybrid model where it's NHS funded, but the services are delivered a bit like abortion services by BPAS? You get referred by a doctor and then you get the service elsewhere. Or would it be completely outside of our existing health system, a bit like Switzerland? So these are all really important, I mean, maybe seen as sort of procedural details, but all details that will be left up to the Secretary of State. And, the issue about drugs, which type of drug will be used, that will be decided by the Secretary of State. And that has really important implications for somebody's death. So many things, I think, people at home will probably be surprised when they see the detail, that they're the sorts of decisions that have to be decided over the next 4 years. And
why have you left those up to other people, Kim?
For me, there's two key points there. One is that we are not trailblazers on this. This choice is being offered to dying people in many other jurisdictions, and we can learn from their experience, and we should do that. And the other point, as Rebecca's just said there, is that we've got a 4-year implementation period. So there's plenty of time to get the infrastructures in place and to get the systems in place that we need to. So I've always said it's better to do this right rather than to rush it. And I think by having that extended commencement period, it enables the Department for Health and healthcare professionals to work together to put the structures in place that we need. But as I say, this is not new. I mean, I had a call yesterday morning with a number of Australian practitioners. We've got the benefit of their experience, and they have a very effective, very safe, very compassionate system which builds into it really patient-centred care, and we can learn from what they've done.
I want to talk about another focus for a moment, though, which is on how much assisted dying is actually going to cost the NHS. A point raised in the Commons by Labour MP Katrina Murray on Tuesday. Here's her question and how the Health Secretary, who opposes assisted dying, Wes Streeting, responded.
One of the main concerns I have about assisted dying is it should never be easier to help someone die than it should be to help them live. If passed, the assisted dying bill would make thousands of terminally ill people every year eligible to end their lives on the NHS. Does our health service have the money to fund this service as well as its priority of bringing down waiting lists?
There isn't money allocated to set up the service in the bill at present, but it's for members of this House and the other place, should the bill proceed, to decide whether or not to proceed, and that's a decision that this government will respect either way.
So quite interesting, actually, because Katrina Murray is an MP for Scotland, where they've got a separate bill going through the Scottish Parliament. So this bill is for England and Wales. But nevertheless, the question is interesting. And the Health Secretary's answer is interesting because he says we haven't costed for it. So, Kim, there are people who say this will then detract resources from the NHS elsewhere.
Yeah, and I disagree with that. I mean, again, we've got 4-year implementation period within the bill, and the government has committed from a neutral position on the issue, but has committed, if it is the will of the House to change the law, that they will facilitate that, it will be workable and it will be operable. So there's a definite commitment there. We've had the impact assessment from the government, which shows that there will be some costs in setting up the service. Of course there will, but actually there will be savings as well. So what I've tried to do is avoid this being about money, because actually it's about compassion and it's about patience and it's about dying people having choice. But in terms of the impact assessment, there is nothing in there that has sent a red flag out in terms of costs. And I hope colleagues find that very reassuring. I mean, the reality is these are not new patients. These are patients who are already in the system because they have a terminal illness. So what we're adding is an extra choice for those patients. And whilst I fully appreciate there will be infrastructure to set up in terms of what the Commission looks like around assisted dying, we're not adding extra cost in that respect because they're already being treated, quite rightly, because they've got a terminal diagnosis.
Kim, what about the fact that if this is publicly funded, as it seems it would be, it will sit alongside services that are not publicly funded? So, social care is often paid for by people themselves at the end of their lives. Hospices are largely funded by charities. So there's going to be this financial inequality. I mean, I want to know how that sits with you.
Well, I think the reality is we've got a relatively new government, and my view is, why can't we improve all those things together? This should not be an either or. We should be looking at social care. We should definitely be looking at palliative and hospice and end-of-life care. And we are doing. And actually, this bill has facilitated those conversations in a way that, if I'm honest, I don't think would have necessarily happened. But what I would hate to happen would be that we do all those things, which are really important, and I passionately believe in as a Labour MP, but at the expense of people who want and deserve and need access to assisted dying. It is not undoable to do all those things together. And actually, in other countries, that is what's happened. We've had a better approach to end-of-life care for people, and that is something I will certainly be championing. And I'll do that whatever happens with the bill. But it would just feel so wrong that we deny people the right to assisted dying because we want to focus on those other things. Let's do it all, and let's have the best approach to end-of-life care that there is around the world. I firmly believe that that is something we can achieve.
Okay, well, look, thank you both for your time. And we couldn't get into all the arguments about assisted dying because there are so many. And I know some people might be listening and feel frustrated that there was a point that we haven't raised that they have been thinking about a lot in relation to this debate. But there just are so many different angles to this that we can't get through them all. I just wanted to finish, Kim, quickly by saying, if the bill passes, as you hope it will, are you confident then that it will get through the Lords and it will all be done in time? Because it could still run out of time if the parliamentary session comes to an end before the bill's passed.
I mean, my priority, Paul, is getting through Friday. It's been a long journey to get to this stage. So that is where I'm focused on at the moment. But I mean, the Commons is the elected chamber in Parliament. And if it is the will of the Commons, then the Lords will do their job. I'm sure there'll be more robust debate. I'm sure there'll be more discussion. I'm not sure how many new arguments can be added. If I'm honest with you, this is not a new debate. I think the first time assisted dying was raised in Parliament was in 1936. So we can have the same conversations again, and it's important that the Lords have their opportunity to do that. But I think it's important that we do pass this bill and it goes through all the stages in this session, and then we can get to that implementation period, because I've spent so many times with families who this means so much to, and indeed with terminally ill people who this means so much to. I had a flurry of emails again last night from people saying, sadly, this will be too late for me, but thank you for doing it. And it's really important that we do this safely and effectively, but also as soon as possible.
Thanks, both of you. Thanks again to Rebecca. And you can see lots more from Rebecca in the coming days as she builds up to that vote on Friday. She'll have lots of analysis and reporting on ITV News. We appreciate all the time that you've given us both in a very busy week.
Thank you.
Now, it's been another big week for Keir Starmer, who joined fellow leaders at the G7 in Canada, with conversation dominated, of course, by the Iran-Israel conflict. Robert was there in Alberta too and got a chance to interview the PM at the end of the trip. And especially for us, he filmed this before getting on the plane home. So over to you, Robert.
Hi, Paul, from Alberta, a place called Kananaskis. And as you can see, although you may, I suppose, be distracted by the tents of the media centre where I'm standing, this is a very pretty part of the country. Amazing mountains, the air absolutely beyond words clean. You can actually sort of, when I got off the bus, I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. Absolutely extraordinary. Anyway, I'm here because I've been trying to get a sense of the sort of way the G7 leaders of the world's most powerful, richest democracies are thinking at the moment about these major global uncertainties, these profoundly worrying conflicts. And, just the last few days, whether it's global events such as Israel's bombing of Iran, or domestic events such as that extraordinary volte-face by the Prime Minister on whether to hold a statutory public inquiry into the scandal, the horror of the grooming gangs and their sexual abuse of children. So a lot to talk to the Prime Minister about, and I should probably just sort of set the scene to a little interview that I've done with him. And the scene is, we flew over on the plane, and very unusual when you have these huddles on board these planes that you get a sort of scoop or an exclusive or breaking news, or however one wants to characterise it on this occasion. But he always comes down the plane when you're flying somewhere and talks to the various journalists like myself who are there. And there was for once a genuinely jaw-dropping moment when, after months of saying they didn't need a statutory national inquiry, he told all of us there would be a statutory national inquiry. And the reason for that is because they asked Louise Casey to review the various investigations there would be. He said actually on the plane something really rather odd, jarring. He said that when he appointed her, her view was there didn't need to be a statutory national inquiry. He was sort of rather revealing himself there, sort of making it clear that from the outset he didn't really want one. Anyway, I have to say Louise Casey is one of those very independent-minded people. If you appoint her, almost anything can happen. And so inevitably her review has found we do need a statutory national inquiry. So that is happening. Somewhat, I'd say, another U-turn by the government. I'd say somewhat embarrassing for him. And then, separate from all of that, there is, of course, and this is the issue that has dominated the agenda here in Canada. What should their position be? What kind of pressure should they be putting on Iran and Israel in these circumstances? Because, this is not just a trauma in terms of loss of lives in Iran and Israel. It's also got profound consequences for the rest of us. There is a genuine risk that this conflict could spill over and prompt wider instability and Indian conflict within the Middle Eastern region. And then, of course, there is the lesser but nonetheless important issue of what it will do to global economic prosperity. The oil price has been rising. We've seen a fairly muted reaction from stock markets, but nonetheless, there is no question that this kind of conflict can damage all of our prosperity, hike inflation, and all, and actually, as I say, essentially, undermine growth and prosperity. So, tons to talk about, and I put as much of this as I could to the Prime Minister in the very small number of minutes that I and other journalists are granted for these interviews on these sorts of occasions. The American president on the trip back yesterday said he was in no mood to negotiate with Iran. He warned citizens of Tehran to evacuate. The American media believe that he's gearing up to bomb Iran.
Well, I don't think that can be read into his comments, and we sat here last night for the best part of 2 hours with the President and put out a G7 statement very shortly afterwards, which was clear about the nuclear threat in relation to Iran, absolutely clear about Israel's right to self-defense, and also the need to de-escalate across the region, including in Gaza, which obviously is linked to the conflict. So
I just want to pick you up.
That statement really, I think, speaks for itself.
Well, it does speak for itself, and you've just said it. Said two very material things. One, that Israel has a right to defend itself, and two, that Iran should not have a nuclear program. So I read that, I think most people read that as an endorsement of Israel's bombing.
No, it uses the word of de-escalation, and I've been absolutely clear that de-escalation is what is needed here.
So Israel was wrong to bomb?
No, the risk of escalation is huge here, and that is a risk to the region, it's a risk to Gaza, and of course it's a risk to our economy, as we've already seen. So that's why I've been absolutely clear about the need to de-escalate.
That's what you want now, but you haven't answered the question whether Israel was right to attack.
Well, it's a fast-moving situation. I've been absolutely clear about Israel's right to self-defense, but my focus has been and remains on the need to de-escalate the situation. And if in doing so we can also bring about a ceasefire in Gaza, that is a good thing, and that is what I've absolutely focused on. It's what we discussed for the best part of 2 hours with the President last night.
I've got to talk to you about the grooming gowns national inquiry. Louise Casey is savagely critical of a general failure to gather evidence on the ethnicity of perpetrators of sex crimes against children. Do you accept that on the left and in the Labour Party there was a willful refusal to see the link between ethnicity and these appalling crimes?
Well, I've set up the National Inquiry and it's got to go wherever the evidence takes it. And if that's into question of ethnicity, then of course it must go into that place. What I can tell you is that, hear me out, I was the chief prosecutor when the first of these cases was brought. I was absolutely clear with my prosecutors that ethnicity should not be a reason to take decisions other than on the evidence and in the public interest. But look, this inquiry now needs to go wherever the evidence takes it, into those issues, into question of whether public officials didn't act in the way that they should, or other assumptions.
But obviously I know you stand by your record, and I've heard you many times say that Kim Leadbeater and Chris Philp did not grasp this issue. But nonetheless, there will be many who say that it wasn't appropriate for you to accuse them of pandering to the far right by calling for a national inquiry, particularly since you now accept the case for a national inquiry.
Well, look, what I was calling out was politicians. I was absolutely clear in my words, not other people, politicians. And the point I was making is this, that they were in power, and when
but you're a courteous person. You've got to accept this looks
Robert,
inappropriate.
Hear me out. These were people who were in power for many years when others of us, myself included, were calling for mandatory reporting in child sexual exploitation cases. It fell on deaf ears. Kim Leadbeater in particular was Minister, I think, for Children and for Women, and not once mentioned this issue. That's what I was calling out. I certainly wasn't calling out a wider group than that, and I stand by that. Having campaigned and worked on this for 15 years, I stand by my own record. I gently point out, courteously as ever, that some of those with the loudest voices now, when they were in power, did absolutely nothing about it and didn't even raise the issue. And others will draw their own conclusions in relation to that.
And this is a yesterday, it's a very quick one. You've done a number of U-turns. Some say the first year has been chaotic. Did you do enough preparation in opposition for government?
Well, look, in the first year, we've done 3 million extra NHS appointments. We've raised the minimum wage for the lowest of those that were paid in relation to the economy. We've got the returns.
Do you deny the chaos?
We've got the first quarter returns for this year, which is the fastest growth in the G7. We've had 4 interest rate cuts in a row. We've had a record amount of investment into the country. The first year was always going to be about clearing up the mess. I think as we now move forward with the spending review, we go into the phase of showing what a difference a Labour government makes in the investments now that we can make in the infrastructure that we need, the hospitals and the public services that we need, and therefore the hard graft, if you like, of clearing up the mess is now to be rewarded in the steps that we're taking to change our country for the better.
Prime Minister, many thanks.
Thank you.
So look, I'll very briefly mention, the one example of willful denial on the Prime Minister's part, that he simply won't engage or didn't engage with me on this question of how badly prepared they were for government. His description of how well things have been going for them, I think, may jar with some of our listeners. If you think about the furore over the abolition of universal entitlement to the winter fuel allowance, if you think about the continuing furore about the way they want to reduce the bill, reduce payments to disabled people through the benefits system, and indeed the pretty humiliating U-turn they've done on the grooming gangs inquiry. But let's just put that to one side, because I think that the most striking thing that he said to me was around Israel and Iran. And I was, the G7 put out a communique last night on their position on this conflict. And it was pretty clear to me when I read it that this was an endorsement of Israel's attack on Iran, because it contained two important sentences. One, that Israel had the right to defend itself, and second, that Iran had absolutely no right, in fact more than that, they should not be allowed to develop nuclear weapons. And in that sense, you've got to, it seemed to be absolute common sense. This is the G7 taking a united front on the side of Israel. So I put this to Keir Starmer, and he denied it. He basically didn't want to engage at all in the idea that Israel was right to do what it had done. All he would say is he was intent on trying to get the two governments to put down their arms. He wanted what he called de-escalation of this conflict between Israel and Iran. And he repeated this point time and again. He wouldn't even engage in what he knew of Iran's development of nuclear weapons. Now, in some ways, many people say it's great that we've got a British Prime Minister that wants a ceasefire, that is trying to play the peacemaker. But it does jar with what Donald Trump has been saying. I mean, at the moment that I was interviewing him, we'd already seen or heard from Donald Trump. He left the G7 actually in a way that I think is very embarrassing for this institution, but he left the G7 a day early on the flight to Washington. He talked about how he was in no mood to negotiate with Iran. He warned citizens of Tehran that they ought to leave that great city, because otherwise their lives would be at risk. And most people who heard him, and certainly much of the American media, took this as him saying that America might well come in, use their military might side by side with Israel in this conflict, do the opposite of de-escalate, which is to escalate. And then we heard, literally at the moment that I was interviewing Keir Starmer in exactly the same place, which is this rather lavish golf club, a few minutes from where I'm standing now. Chancellor Merz of Germany, German leader, is on the balcony above where we're doing our interviews, and he is telling German media, ZDF, the television station in particular, that he regards Israel as essentially doing the West's dirty work, and it's very courageous of Israel. He's endorsing Israel's bombing. He uses incredibly strong language about essentially how evil the Iranian government has been and what a threat it poses to all civilized nations, not just Israel. And he says it's absolutely clear that Iran's nuclear capacity, or a capacity to make nuclear weapons, has to be destroyed. And he also implies that that can't be done by Israel alone, that they may not have the sufficient hardware. And he's therefore implying that other rich nations, and in particular the US, may have to come in side by side with Israel to destroy these facilities where these nuclear weapons are made. Now, I'm not making a judgment about whether the Trump-German belligerent position when it comes to Iran is the correct one, or whether the Keir Starmer pacifying position is the right one. What I am noting is that there is a tremendous split between the two camps. Keir Starmer tries to paper over those cracks, but those cracks are a mile wide. And at a time when this conflict in the Middle East is genuinely a threat to all of us, economically probably, where we live, and obviously to lives in the Middle East. This split is deeply troubling, because what you would want to see from the leaders of democratic nations is unity on this issue, and we have the opposite of that.
Thanks, Robert. That's all for this episode. Thank you for joining me these past few weeks. Tom is going to be back with Robert next week for more Talking Politics. And remember, you can watch every episode on ITVX, YouTube and Spotify, and listen as well on every podcast platform. Just hit subscribe. Until the next time, thanks for joining me.